In the mid-2000s, there was a version of football that felt weightless. Ronaldinho Gaúcho did not just play the game. He made it look like a private joke he was sharing with the ball. At Barcelona, he became the most joyful destroyer of defenses the sport had seen in a generation. Defenders lunged and arrived late. Goalkeepers guessed wrong. Crowds rose before the move was even finished because they already knew how it would end. In 2002, he had helped deliver a World Cup to Brazil. In 2005, the Ballon d'Or confirmed what everyone already felt. The magician was at the absolute center of the game. The smile was permanent. The tongue out, the shimmy, the no-look pass. These were not tricks. They were the public face of a player who seemed immune to pressure. While other superstars carried the weight of expectation like armor, Ronaldinho treated the biggest stages as if they were backstreet games that had simply grown larger lights. For a few years, the world believed the smile was the whole story. But the same years that produced the highlights also produced the first quiet fractures. The parties began to last longer than the recovery sessions. The circle around him grew. Many of the people closest to the player had no professional incentive to protect the athlete, only the celebrity. Nights blurred into mornings. Training sometimes became optional in spirit, even when it remained compulsory on paper. The body that had once recovered overnight started to carry the nights with it. A half yard of pace disappeared. A fraction of sharpness left the final pass. None of it was dramatic enough to make front-page news. The smile was still there. The goals still came. The myth was still intact. Teammates and coaches would later describe the pattern in careful, almost protective language. The talent remained enormous, but the margins that separate the immortal from the merely brilliant were beginning to erode. The same charm that opened every door in the city also kept the wrong doors open. The lifestyle was not yet a scandal. It was still framed as personality, the eternal child who simply refused to grow up. By the time the public still believed the smile was enough, the private life had already started writing a different ending. The magician had not fallen. He had simply begun to live in a way that made the magic harder to summon on demand. The crowds had not noticed. The cameras had not noticed. The legend was still safe. That is where the story turns. The smile remained public. The corrosion had already begun. The smile was still public. The corrosion had already begun. What followed was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow, almost polite unraveling. The same habits that had once been framed as personality now began to write themselves into the body and the performances. Recovery sessions shortened while the nights lengthened. The circle around him continued to expand, filled with people who needed Ronaldinho the celebrity far more than they needed Ronaldinho the athlete. Money moved quickly. Opportunities multiplied. Discipline did not. Injuries that once healed in days began to linger for weeks. The explosive first step that had left defenders grasping at air lost a fraction of its violence. Matches that used to feel inevitable became labored. At Barcelona, the affection remained, but the automatic selection did not. When the move to Milan came in 2008, it was still framed as a new chapter. In reality, it was the first public admission that the previous chapter had not ended cleanly. The invitations never stopped. The charm that had once opened every door in the game now kept the wrong doors open. Training grounds became places he visited rather than places he lived. The body carried the evidence before the newspapers did. The extra weight, the longer recovery, the moments when the old magic appeared only in flashes instead of entire halves. Coaches spoke carefully. Teammates protected the legend in public even as they adjusted to a different player in private. Clubs that had once fought for his signature began to calculate risk. The brand was still enormous. The footballer underneath it was becoming harder to rely on. Each new destination offered a fresh start and a familiar pattern: early hope, visible talent, and the gradual return of the same lifestyle that had followed him from Barcelona. The money continued to flow in. The structure around him continued to prioritize the image over the engine that produced it. By the early 2010s, the external world had finally caught up with what the private world had known for years. The magician was no longer in control of the act. The smile could still appear for the cameras. The body and the focus could no longer guarantee the performance that had once made the smile legendary. The myth had not been destroyed in a single night. It had been eroded, season by season, decision by decision, until the gap between the legend and the man became impossible to ignore. That gap would not stay private for much longer. In March 2020, the myth finally met the legal system. Ronaldinho and his brother were arrested in Paraguay after entering the country with a fake passport. The images that followed were clinical and irreversible. The former Ballon d'Or winner in custody, the same face that had once lit up the Camp Nou, now framed by the fluorescent lights of a police station. The prison cell replaced the VIP lounges. The permanent smile was still attempted for the cameras, but the setting had changed everything. What had been protected for years by charm, nostalgia, and selective memory was now a matter of public record. The arrest was not a random misfortune. It was the visible endpoint of a longer pattern. Years of loose financial decisions, unpaid obligations, and a lifestyle that had never been forced to account for itself had narrowed the options until a fake document seemed like a workable solution. The fortune that had once appeared endless had already been eroded by the same circle and the same habits that had followed him since the peak. Businesses failed, tax issues accumulated. The money that had flowed so easily during the years of pure magic proved far harder to keep once the performances stopped guaranteeing the next check. Inside the prison, the story became simpler. The man who had made football feel weightless now measured time in locked doors and restricted movement. Reports described the initial conditions, the later transfer to house arrest, the attempts to maintain dignity in a situation that offered very little of it. Outside, the public narrative completed its transformation. The eternal child of the game became a cautionary tale. Documentaries, articles, and social media threads reduced a complex decline into a single moral. This is what happens when talent is left unprotected from itself and from the people who profit from its myth. Yet the deeper question is not only how a genius ends up in a cell. It is what the years before the cell reveal about the system that surrounded him. The same environment that celebrated the smile had little interest in building the structure that might have preserved the player. Agents, associates, clubs, and media all benefited from the version of Ronaldinho that never needed to grow up. Discipline was negotiable as long as the brand remained valuable. The lifestyle was indulged as long as the highlight reels still worked. Only when the body and the focus could no longer deliver did the protection thin out. By the time the handcuffs appeared, the important damage had already been done in private. The arrest simply made it impossible to look away. The applause had been loud for years. The silence that followed was heavier, because it forced a reckoning with everything the applause had been willing to ignore. The magician did not fall in a single night. He was allowed to keep performing long after the act had begun to consume him. And when the music finally stopped, the cell was only the last room in a house that had been emptying for a long time.